In 1949, Oldsmobile unveiled an engine that would change everything. Not just for one company, not just for one decade, for an entire culture of American automobiles that would define speed, power, and rebellion for generations to come. They called it the Rocket 88, and the man behind it, Ransom Eli Olds. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it should. He founded Oldsmobile back in 1897, making it one of the oldest automobile manufacturers in American history. But here's the thing. By the time the Rocket 88 came around, Olds had been out of his own company for decades. The engine that bore his legacy was built by engineers he never met, in a factory he no longer controlled. And yet, without Ransom Olds, without his philosophy, his obsession with innovation, his belief that engineering could define a generation, none of it would have happened. This is the story of how one engine outsmarted every competitor in America and accidentally created the muscle car era. Along the way, we're going to see corporate betrayals, engineering genius, a song that might have invented rock and roll, and a race for power that changed the automobile forever. So let's begin. But first, who exactly was Ransom Olds, and how did he build the foundation for all of this? Ransom Eli Olds was born in 1864 in Geneva, Ohio, but his family moved to Lansing, Michigan when he was a kid. His father ran a machine shop, and young Ransom basically grew up surrounded by engines, gears, and grease. By his teenage years, he was already tinkering with steam engines. By his early 20s, he had built his first gasoline-powered vehicle. This was the 1890s. Most people had never seen a car. Ransom Olds was already building them. In 1897, he founded the Olds Motor Vehicle Company, which would eventually become Oldsmobile. And right from the start, Olds had a philosophy that set him apart from almost everyone else in the early automobile industry. He believed in engineering first, not aesthetics, not luxury, not status symbols, engineering. He wanted to build cars that worked better than anyone else's, cars that were reliable, efficient, and, this is important, affordable. His first major success came in 1901 with the curved-dash Oldsmobile. It was simple, it was cheap, and it was the first mass-produced automobile in American history. Not the Model T, that came later, the curved dash. Ransom Olds invented mass production before Henry Ford made it famous. He was producing over 400 cars per year by 1901, which doesn't sound like much now, but back then, that was revolutionary. By 1904, Oldsmobile was the best-selling car in America. But here's where it gets complicated. See, Olds had investors, and those investors had their own ideas about what Oldsmobile should be. They wanted bigger cars, more expensive cars, cars for wealthy people, not common folks. Ransom Olds wanted to keep building affordable vehicles. The fight got ugly. And in 1904, Ransom Olds was forced out of his own company. I want you to think about that for a second. The man who founded Oldsmobile, the man who invented mass production, the man whose name was literally on the building, pushed out. He would go on to found REO Motor Car Company, named after his initials, and he'd have some success there. But Oldsmobile? That was his baby. And he had to watch from the sidelines as other people decided its future. For the next few decades, Oldsmobile bounced around. It became part of General Motors in 1908, which meant it was now one brand among many in a massive corporate empire. The company made decent cars, nothing spectacular. They were reliable, respectable, middle-of-the-road vehicles for middle-of-the-road Americans, the kind of car your accountant might drive. And then came World War II. Now, I mention this because the war changed everything about American manufacturing. During the war, automobile factories switched to producing tanks, aircraft engines, military vehicles. Engineers who had spent years designing car engines were suddenly designing engines for bombers. And when the war ended in 1945, all of those engineers came back to the automobile industry with new ideas, new technologies, new ambitions. The late 1940s were a strange time for American cars. On one hand, There was massive pent-up demand. Nobody had been able to buy a new car during the war, so everyone wanted one. On the other hand, the technology was stale. Most cars in 1946 were basically warmed-over designs from 1942. The engines were old, the styling was old. Everything felt like it was waiting for something new. General Motors knew this, and they decided to do something about it. In 1949, Oldsmobile introduced the Rocket 88 engine, and honestly, it changed everything. The Rocket was a V8 engine. Now V8s weren't new. They'd been around since the early 1900s. But the Rocket was different. It was an overhead valve V8, which was a significant departure from the flathead designs that had dominated American automobiles for decades. Let me explain why this matters. In a flathead engine, the valves sit beside the cylinders. It's a simple design, reliable, but it has limitations. The airflow isn't great. The compression ratio is limited. You can only get so much power out of it before you hit a wall. In an overhead valve engine, also called a push rod engine, the valves sit above the cylinders in the cylinder head. This allows for much better airflow, higher compression ratios, and significantly more power. The Rocket 88 had a compression ratio of 7.25.1, which might not sound impressive today, but in 1949, that was aggressive. That was ambitious. The engine displaced 303 cubic inches, just under 5 liters, and produced 135 horsepower. Again, that number might seem modest by modern standards. But here's the context. The average American car in 1949 was making maybe 90 to 100 horsepower. Some were making less. The Rocket was producing 35 to 50% more power than most of its competitors. But here's the real genius. Oldsmobile didn't put this engine in their big, heavy flagship cars. They put it in their lightest body, the 88 series. This was a deliberate decision. The engineers understood something that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary at the time. Power-to-weight ratio matters more than raw power alone. The Oldsmobile 88 with the Rocket engine weighed around 3,500 pounds. That's not light by sports car standards, but it was significantly lighter than the big Buicks and Cadillacs of the era. Combined with that 135 horsepower engine, it meant the 88 could accelerate faster than almost anything else on the road, and people noticed immediately. The 1949 Oldsmobile 88 won 6 of the 9 NASCAR Grand National races that year, 6 out of 9, in its first year of existence. The car was so dominant that other manufacturers started scrambling to respond. Suddenly, everyone needed an overhead valve V8. Suddenly, everyone was talking about power-to-weight ratios. Suddenly, performance mattered in a way it hadn't before. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets really interesting. Because the Rocket 88 didn't just win races, it created a cultural moment. In 1951, a song called Rocket 88 was recorded by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, though it was actually Ike Turner's band under a different name. The song was about the car. You women have heard of jalopies, you heard the noise they make. But let me introduce you to my Rocket 88. The song had a driving beat, distorted guitar, and an energy that felt completely new. Many music historians consider Rocket 88 to be one of the first rock and roll songs ever recorded. Some call it the first rock and roll song. Now there's debate about this, there always is, but the point stands. An Oldsmobile engine became so culturally significant that it inspired a song that might have invented an entire genre of music. Think about that. The Rocket 88 wasn't just an engine, it was a symbol. It represented something new about American culture, speed, power, rebellion. The idea that you could buy a factory car and beat almost anything else on the road. That you didn't need a custom hot rod or an expensive European import. You could walk into an Oldsmobile dealer, write a check, and drive away in the fastest car in America. This is what I mean when I say the Rocket 88 created the muscle car era. It established the formula. Take a powerful V8 engine, put it in a relatively light, affordable body, market it to young people who want to go fast. That formula would define American performance cars for the next several decades. But Oldsmobile wasn't done innovating. Through the early 1950s, they kept improving the rocket engine. They increased displacement. They raised compression ratios. They added horsepower. By 1957, the rocket had grown to 371 cubic inches and was producing over 300 horsepower in some configurations. The engine that had started at 135 horsepower had more than doubled its output in less than a decade, and the competition was fierce. Chevrolet introduced their small block V8 in 1955. Ford responded with their own overhead valve designs. Chrysler came out with the Hemi. The power wars had begun, and they wouldn't stop for years. But Oldsmobile had the head start. They had established themselves as the performance brand within General Motors. While Chevrolet was the everyman choice and Cadillac was the luxury option, Oldsmobile was for people who wanted to go fast. Their advertising leaned into this. "Make a date with a Rocket 88" became one of the most famous automotive slogans of the era. Now, I should mention something about Ransom Olds during all of this. By the time the Rocket 88 was dominating racetracks and inspiring rock songs, Ransom was an old man. He had retired from REO Motor Car Company in 1936. He spent his later years in Lansing, watching from a distance as the company he founded became synonymous with American performance. Did he know what the Rocket 88 meant? Did he understand that his philosophy, engineering first, innovation above all else, had finally found its ultimate expression in an engine he never touched? I don't know. I'd like to think he did. I'd like to think he saw those NASCAR victories and smiled, knowing that his belief in engineering had been vindicated. Ransom Olds died in 1950, just 1 year after the Rocket 88 was introduced. He was 86 years old. He had lived long enough to see the beginning of what his legacy would become, but not long enough to see how far it would go, and it went far. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the muscle car era that the Rocket 88 had started exploded. The Pontiac GTO arrived in 1964, often called the first true muscle car. The Ford Mustang came out the same year. Dodge had the Charger. Plymouth had the Roadrunner. Chevrolet had the Camaro and the Chevelle SS. Every American manufacturer was building high-powered, relatively affordable performance cars. All of them, every single one, owed something to the Rocket 88. Not just the engineering principles, though those mattered, but the idea, the concept that a factory car could be fast, that performance could be democratized, that you didn't need to be rich to drive something exciting. The engineers at Oldsmobile in 1949 probably didn't realize they were starting a revolution. They were just trying to build a better engine. They were following the philosophy that Ransom Olds had established decades earlier: engineering first, always. But in doing so, they created something that transcended the automobile industry entirely. Let me give you some perspective on how dominant the Rocket was in those early years. In 1950, Red Byron won the NASCAR championship driving an Oldsmobile 88. In 1951 and 1952, the 88 continued to rack up victories. Other manufacturers were playing catch-up, and it would take them years to close the gap. The Rocket engine wasn't just powerful, it was durable. It could handle the stress of racing in ways that other engines couldn't. Part of this was the overhead valve design, which allowed for better cooling. Part of it was the quality of the engineering. Oldsmobile had built an engine that was ahead of its time, and it showed on every racetrack in America. But here's the thing about being ahead of your time. Eventually, everyone catches up. By the mid-1950s, other manufacturers had developed their own high-performance V8s. Chevrolet's small block was lighter and cheaper. Chrysler's Hemi was more powerful, Ford was improving rapidly, Oldsmobile was no longer the only game in town. The company responded by continuing to innovate. They introduced the J2 rocket in 1957, which featured 3 two-barrel carburetors and produced 312 horsepower. They kept increasing displacement, eventually reaching 455 cubic inches in their biggest engines. But they were now one competitor among many, rather than the undisputed leader. This is the cycle of innovation, I suppose. Someone makes a breakthrough, everyone else copies it. Eventually, the breakthrough becomes the standard, and you have to find the next thing. The Rocket 88 changed what was possible, and then that new possibility became the baseline everyone else built upon. The muscle car era peaked in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Cars like the Oldsmobile 442, which stood for 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, and dual exhausts, carried on the performance legacy. The 442 was a genuine muscle car with big engines and aggressive styling, and all the swagger you'd expect. But then came the oil crisis of 1973 and emissions regulations, and insurance rates that made high-powered cars expensive to own. The muscle car era didn't end overnight, but it faded. By the mid-1970s, the big V8s had been detuned for emissions compliance. Performance numbers dropped. The cars that had once been symbols of American power became shadows of their former selves. Oldsmobile survived, but it was never the same. The brand shifted toward more practical, more fuel-efficient vehicles. The rocket name lingered, but it no longer meant what it once had. The company that had defined American performance became just another General Motors division, making cars that were competent but unremarkable. And what of Oldsmobile itself? In 2004, General Motors discontinued the brand entirely. After 107 years, the name that Ransom Olds had put on automobiles back in 1897 disappeared from American roads. The company that had invented mass production, that had created the muscle car formula, that had inspired rock and roll, gone. It's a bittersweet ending. But maybe that's not the right way to think about it, because the Rocket 88's legacy isn't about what happened to Oldsmobile as a company. It's about what happened to American car culture because of what Oldsmobile did in 1949. Every modern performance car owes something to the thinking behind the Rocket 88. The idea that power-to-weight ratio matters. The idea that overhead valve engines are superior to flatheads. The idea that performance can be accessible, not just reserved for the wealthy or the mechanically gifted. These weren't obvious in 1949. They became obvious because the Rocket 88 proved them. And Ransom Olds, the man who was pushed out of his own company in 1904, his philosophy won in the end. Engineering first, innovation above all else. Build something that works better than what came before, and people will notice. He didn't design the Rocket 88 engine. He never touched it. By the time it was built, he was an elderly man who had been away from Oldsmobile for over 40 years. But without his vision, without his belief that engineering could define a generation, it never would have happened. The culture he created at Oldsmobile, the obsession with doing things better, that's what produced the rocket. There's a lesson there, I think, about how innovation works, about how one person's ideas can echo through an organization long after they're gone. Ransom Olds probably never imagined his name would be associated with NASCAR victories and rock and roll songs. He just wanted to build better engines. And because he did, because he created a company that valued engineering above all else, the Rocket 88 became possible. The muscle car era is often dated from the Pontiac GTO in 1964, but that's like saying the Renaissance started in Florence without mentioning what came before. The GTO existed because the Rocket 88 had already proven the formula. Someone had to be first, someone had to show that it could work, that someone was Oldsmobile in 1949, following principles that Ransom Olds had established half a century earlier. And that is the story of the Rocket 88. One engine, one company, one man whose name and philosophy outlasted everything else. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Ransom Olds before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.